Hey everyone, so today I'm going to talk about how to use Illustrator to import figures and images from other programs and sort of arrange them into uniformly stylized panels. I'm also going to cover image masking and clipping. So let's just go right into it. So I'm going to create a new Illustrator document for this. Let's call it imported figures. And yeah, I want it to be letter sized and to have the color profile CMYK. Great. So let me just turn on my video rulers here. Great. So let's just get right to it. So I made a chart in Excel, which I exported as a PDF. And I'm going to pop that in here first and show you how to work with one of these Excel exported charts. So let's go to my desktop. Here it is. Now, for most programs like PowerPoint and stuff like that, it's totally fine to just drag and drop these kinds of figures into the program. And as you can see, if you do that in Illustrator, you get the figure in here, but actually no elements of this figure are selectable individually. So we're actually not going to be able to change any of their features or styles if we just drag and drop this figure in here. So I'm going to get rid of it. Rather than drag and drop it in, I prefer to place the objects because it actually carries over information about the individual vectors and components of a figure when you do this. So I'm going to click place. I'm going to select the same plot. We're going to get this little preview window here, but I'm just going to hit OK. And although this doesn't look that different, with the exception of some of the font or text not carrying over into Illustrator, although this doesn't look that different from when we dragged and dropped it, actually now each of these elements is its own object. So we will be able to sort of edit them individually. But before we can do that, we have to release them from the various clipping masks and groups that Excel sort of imposes on the figure. So to release the clipping masks first, I'm going to hit Alt-Command-7 a couple of times, and you'll see these clipping masks sort of appear now. And now I'm going to ungroup them from each other by hitting Command-Shift-G a few times as well. So great, now we have individually selectable components and clipping masks that we can sort of highlight and remove like so. Great, like this. There's a bunch of these. Usually they're found around the edges of the individual objects, see, like that. Great, so now we've gotten rid of some of the excess features of the graph, and I'm actually not a huge fan of Excel's grid bars, so I'm getting rid of those. And just for the sake of simplicity, I'm gonna remove some of these bars so that it's just easier to show you how to edit some of these things. Move this inward and then move the whole cluster closer to the actual axis. Let's move this over here also. Fantastic. So great. So already we've done quite a bit to this to the original figure. Let's correct some of this. And this issue with importing the font might actually just be an issue with my computer. This may not happen to you when you place your Excel exported charts, so I apologize if this is not something that you're going to have to deal with. So I know from looking at this figure before what the values for this axis are. So I'm just popping them in here manually. And last is 0.3. Okay, great. So to make this easier for myself later, I'm going to justify my text to the right. And now you can see that when I did that, they suddenly all sort of misaligned from each other. So if I select them all again, I can align them all to sort of their right-hand extremes. So I'm going to click that, and they're all going to align to their rightmost points. And now I have right justified text, so that if I were to change the size of the text, they would stay sort of aligned to this right-hand side, makes it easier to deal with them later. So this line is a little too subtle gray, so I'm going to change it to black. I'm also going to increase, its stroke width to 1 so we can see it a little bit better. And I'm actually going to extend this line using the pen tool. So I'm going to continue off the end of this axis line. I'm going to hit shift as I'm doing this so that I can create a completely horizontal extension to make an x-axis here. So there we go. We have enough room to kind of put this in here. This will sort of give us a nice like bounding limit to our figure. Or of course you can just keep this off to the side if you want. Okay, great. So unfortunately, the subdivision that we did when we unmasked and we ungrouped creates some redundant elements in the figure. So for instance, this fill color for this bar is actually just its own square. So if we were to delete it, you can see that actually you just end up with the box still there, but just unfilled. So what I'm going to do actually is I'm going to bring it back for a second, and I'm going to remove all the elements that are essentially just like redundant fills in this, for this cell type. So I'm going to select things that are the same fill color, and I'm going to delete them. So now we end up with these like empty boxes, which we can select again, like that, and we can actually create the color. We can actually put the color back this way. Now, unfortunately, because I didn't save the color before, what I'm gonna do is before I delete this, because I do want to use the same color again, I just want to make sure to add it to objects that aren't redundant here, is I'm going to select these items here. So these are the colors that I've chosen for my different cell types. And I'm going to create a color palette that contains all of these colors. So if I click on this little color wheel at the top bar of the program called Recolor Artwork, it's going to create a color palette that contains all of these different elements. And so I can quickly select them later from the color menu so that I don't have to memorize the CMYK values or anything like that. So I'm going to call this Project Colors. And I can add this to these color groups here. And now basically, if we wanted to change the fill color of an object, we have this extra color palette that contains our project's specific colors. So now let's go back and do what we just did before. We're going to select things that are this fill color. I'm going to delete them. Now I'm going to select objects that have this line color, so the stroke color, perfect, and I'm going to fill them with our other blue. Perfect. So now these are singular objects that have both a line and a fill, as opposed to two different objects where one has a line and just one has a fill. I'm going to do the same thing here, so select same fill color, delete it, select same stroke color, and fill it with that orange. And one more time, select same fill color and delete, and select same stroke color and fill with our light gray. Perfect. Okay, so, let's say like we wanted to change this width of the lines or the stroke. Let's make them 1 or 1.5 even. They're a little bit thicker now. I don't like the sort of sharp edges on the ends of these error bars, so I'm going to round them by changing the cap to round cap, and I'm also going to round the corners so that the corners of these bars are a little bit softer. Great. So to me this looks a little bit better. I am going to put this in here though. Alright, great. Now we can also put the labels at the bottom of the graph here, but that's sort of a stylistic choice that you can make yourself. I'm going to change the fonts though to Arial, and yeah, I was going to make them bold, but maybe I'll leave them the way they are. Great, so here we have our first graph. Now I'm going to make a panel label, A, and I'm going to do that as a center aligned text. I'm going to bold this for sure, and I'm going to make it a little larger. Great. Now I don't have any axis labels. Obviously you should definitely put axis labels in whatever you're doing, but that's something that everybody knows already. Okay, so let's make our second panel. And for the second panel, I'm going to import an image. So, and I'll show you two ways to do that. So with an image, we can obviously place it just like we did with the graph from Excel, or we can drag and drop the image into Illustrator. Because images don't typically have things that we need to select individually, we just need them for their whole content. So if you drag and drop an image into Illustrator, so this is a picture of my dog Luna. If you drag and drop the image in here, it remains linked to its original source file in your computer's directory. So if I was to change this picture of Luna, let's say if I was to edit like how bright some of these colors are, or if I was to change the contrast and save this, the changes that I've made to this image will appear in the image that I've put into this document. So this wants me to refresh the image, so I'm going to hit yes, and you can see that the contrast changes appear here. So this is useful if you actually still plan on making some exposure, brightness, contrast adjustments to your images, and you don't have the sort of final versions of the images yet. This is sort of put in there as a placeholder. Alright, great. So I'm going to scale this. Let's see, this is 10 inches big right now, so let's make it 4 inches wide so we can work with it a little bit better. So each item or object in an Illustrator document has a reference point, and that's this little grid here. So the reference point basically tells you from where you will be sort of placing or resizing an object. So for instance, if with my picture selected, if I hit that the reference point is this upper left corner, and if I resize it, it'll resize from the upper left corner out. Same thing with its position. So its position is actually now being referred to by this point. I prefer referring to objects from their center point because it resizes equally from all sides, as you can see here. Okay, so let's put Luna here, but you know, I don't need all this excess space or excess image in my panel, so I'm going to mask part of the image. So there's a couple ways to do this. One way is when you click on the image, there's an option, there's a button at the top to just mask the object. You can also do it through Object Clipping Mask. You can make a clipping mask, and I'll do it that way. So basically this button up here and this will do the exact same thing. They'll create a frame around your object that will serve as sort of like the edges of where you want the image to appear. So I'm resizing the mask right now just to include the dog in the picture. There we go. Great, so now we have a clipped version of this picture. Oops. So the original picture still exists. So if you go into Layers, the original image still exists, but now it has a clipping mask and has been grouped together with this mask. So in the lower right here, you can see that when you've selected the whole group, you're selecting only the part that is allowed to be shown by the mask. But my original image still exists, so if I click on this little sidebar here to select the individual components of the group, you can see where its actual edges are. So this is the original image's edges. And additionally, so this object just above it is its clipping mask. If I want to, I can hide the clipping mask to see what my original image actually looks like. And I can bring it back. And if I want to edit the clipping mask, I can select it within the group and actually resize it as I see fit. So, like that. Great. So the clipping group here is important to know about if you ever want to adjust the size of your clipping mask, or if you just want to be reminded of where the original bounds of your image are, etc., etc. Okay, so just like with any, let's say, confocal or microscopy image, I want to add some labels to this picture. So I'm going to make some text. Let's write dog. And I'm going to justify it to the left because I want it to sort of sit against the like upper left part of the image. But the dog in this picture is not black, so I'm going to use the eyedropper tool to actually select a color off of the image to make the text match the dog color. Okay, I'm going to make a duplicate text object and call it, I don't know, glasses. And I can do the same with the pair of glasses, so I'm going to use the eyedropper tool to recolor the word to match what's actually in the image. So now I have a labeled picture of a dog with glasses. So that's our second panel. Now these two objects are obviously different sizes. Now there are two ways to get around this. I can either resize the picture of the dog to sort of match the dimensions of our plot in panel A, or I can resize panel A. And I feel more inclined to do that actually because I don't want this picture to necessarily be too big in my figure. So when you resize data, you have to be extremely careful because you obviously don't want to actually change where the data fall on your graph. That would be data manipulation. So whenever you resize graphs, you have to make sure to resize everything in the graph the same way, including the axes. And this is extremely important, again, because you don't want to accidentally manipulate any of your data. So if I'm compressing this to match the size of my image here, there are a couple ways to do this. So I can look at the size dimensions of this picture. So this is 3.2. Let's make the height actually an even 3. Good. I'm gonna move this a little bit. And I can make this also an even 3 height-wise. There we go. And I suppose move it up so that it's in line with our image. Now, if I grouped these objects together, which I just did using Command G, then I could actually align the two objects together using some of these alignment features. So let's say I want to align them to the bottom to make sure everything's exactly the same along the bottom, then I just hit align to the bottom, and now we have our graph in the exact alignment as our image. Great. Alright, so the problem here obviously is that now we have these rogue axes labels, but if you know roughly where your original labels were, then you can pop the labels back onto the position where they were found along the extent of your axis. So I would do the very top one because that's easy to find, and the very bottom one. And since we know these are all equally spaced from each other, we can actually use the distribute feature to evenly distribute or evenly space them across the axis. So that's one of the alignment features. So with all of our axes labels selected, we can distribute them vertically along the axis. So basically, if you click this, what it's doing is it's distributing these objects evenly and equally spacing them across the entire axis. So okay, there we go. We've basically reestablished our graph labels. And now these panels look the same size. Great. So let's make 2 more panels, C and D. Okay, so for C, why don't we try putting in another image. And this time, rather than dragging and dropping it in here, I'm going to place the image just to show you that what the difference in the 2 methods is. So I'm going to place a picture of my other dog, Mo. Now, when you place the image into the document, it does not stay linked to the image in your computer's directory. So if I was to change this picture of Mo outside of Illustrator, it would not update the one that's in Illustrator anymore. And this is fine if you obviously don't want to, if you don't want the image to be updated in any way. The other thing to note is that for the other, just get this out of the way. For the other picture, so when we drag and drop this picture in here, because it stays linked to the file that's in your computer's directory, if you open this Illustrator document on a different computer, it won't be able to find that image in the path on that computer because your image won't be there. So that's often why if you send somebody an Illustrator file where you've drag and dropped items into the document that are still linked to files on the computer, then that person won't be able to see those images. So if you're concerned about that, I would recommend placing your images instead of dragging and dropping them into the document. There's also other ways to deal with that, but this is probably the best strategy for avoiding files not loading across computers. Okay, so here's this little picture of Mo. And you know, there's again all this extraneous information that I don't want. So I'm gonna mask part of the image. I'm gonna do it using a different strategy though. So you can create masks from basically any drawn shape that you want. So if I wanted to create, so let's just for fun use the star tool to make a star shape. We'll give it an edge so that we can see it relative to our picture. And, you know, I put this star shape around Mo. Maybe we should rotate it so that he fits a little better into the picture. Something like this, maybe. Well, you get the idea. So, yeah, well, let's keep it straight. Okay. Maybe we'll just resize it. Let's try like that. Yeah. Okay, great. So we've resized it so that he fits inside the little star shape now. Great. Now, if I select, yeah, we're going to get some of the edge here. All right, perfect. So if I select the object that I just created and the picture together, so I just shift-clicked the picture to select them both together, and I go to Object and I go to Clipping Mask and I say Make Clipping Mask. Basically, Illustrator will use the shape that I drew to create a mask for my picture. So yeah, you know, you don't really see a lot of stars in scientific papers. So I'm going to get rid of this clipping mask. And just like I did it for the Excel graph that we imported, I'm going to release the clipping mask by doing Command Option 7. So now the two objects are separate from each other. And I want to get rid of the star because I don't want to use it anymore. Instead, maybe I will, how about with the pencil tool, I'll sort of do a very crude freehand draw outline around the dog, like that. And I'll close my lines, like this. Let's get closer so we can really see what's going on here. There we go. All right, let's give it a color so we can kind of see it. Yeah, all right, you know, it's the shape of the dog. So I'm gonna select the two together. I'm gonna do Command 7, which is the shortcut for making the clipping mask. And now I have a masked version of my picture of the dog. And I can resize this however I want, like that, great. I want it to be roughly centered with my other panel, so just try to get them aligned together here. Now remember, because I grouped these objects together, I can actually sort of align these two things together. So if I say, like, I want the centers of these objects to be aligned, I can do a horizontal alignment to their centers, like that. Great. Perfect. So this is our second picture. Now for our fourth panel, I'm going to import a graph from Prism. So let's go into Prism. Let's open a different window here. This one. All right, great. So I have this graph here. I'm going to copy it because Prism actually sort of lets you copy these vector diagrams and paste them directly into Illustrator, which is very convenient. But again, you end up with all this like imposed clipping mask and grouping that you need to get rid of. So while we have our object selected, let's just Option Command 7, get rid of a bunch of this stuff, ungroup a couple times, make sure we've really got it there. And now we can select these extraneous elements and we have individually selectable objects within our graph. So move this a little bit closer. There we go. Perfect. All right. So let's pretend like our data from here is just a different experiment for the same groups that we have up here. So we don't even need to relabel these by hand. We can just grab these guys and bring them down here. And again, like, we want them to be aligned well, so I'm going to move this one to that center and I'm going to distribute them horizontally so that they're evenly separated across this axis. Perfect, like that. But again, I want the colors to match across the different panels because these are the same cells as these, and I want the group coloring to be the same. So here's what I'm gonna do. So remember, we made a color palette that includes all of our different group colors when we first started editing this panel. So I still have those colors available to me through this drop down here. So I'm gonna select, for instance, all of the points that have this blue color here. I'm going to do select same fill color, which will select all of these points along here. And I'm going to recolor them with one of our approved colors. I think it's this one. So this is actually not that different a color. I'm going to select the line part of this object and do the same thing. And now these guys have the same color. Great. So let's do that with this one. So select same fill color. It'll select all the red dots in our picture. And I want these guys to be that orange color that we have selected before. And same with the line. Great. And finally, select all the objects with this color, change them to that gray. Good, and the line as well. Perfect. So now our color schemes match across these panels. And we could probably, so let's make the line weights the same here. So I'm going to ask it to select things that have the same stroke weight, so basically line thickness. I actually don't want to change these, so I'm going to deselect them with shift click. I only really wanted to change the axis lines, so I'm going to make them 1. And yeah, so now, good. Now we have our axis thickness matching across the panels. So this is a 1 point thickness as well. And I also want the text to match. So I'm going to eyedropper to this text, and it'll carry over the formatting for this text as well. And they're misaligned, so let's align them there. Great. And we can move them back closer here. Now these guys, I want to do this as well, but I actually want to keep them center aligned. And now they're off of their axis ticks, so I'm going to move them back like this, and the rest I will horizontally distribute like so. Great. Perfect. Let's make this the same. So this is, let's say, experiment 2. This is experiment 1. Cool. Great. So now we have these 4 panels, which we made using images or graphs from various sources. Now, having the individual items in each of these objects selectable is extremely useful for being able to stylize graphs evenly across the different panels. You want consistency in your color. Also, creating the color palette was a big help because it means that we have quick access to all the colors we actually want to use across our different samples. So that is also incredibly important. I would recommend, if possible, grouping objects across, like within individual panels. So panel B is its own group, panel A is its own group. There's already a group in here, so I'm going to quickly ungroup them and regroup. And, well, this is a single object already, so we don't have to group that. But now, basically, what you can see is that aside from our panel labels, A, B, C, D, we now have a bunch of individual groups, and now each object within each group can be selected once you're inside the group. So if you double click on a group, you enter a group isolation, which means that if you manipulate, so if I were to do, for instance, if I were to select from here objects that have the same fill color, if we were working on the entire document before, it not only would have selected these colored arrows, but it also would have selected this guy because this guy is the same fill color. But because we're currently in a group isolation mode, it will only select these objects within the group. Now, if you do want to select objects outside of the group from within group isolation, once you have your object selected, you go into exit isolation mode by right-clicking and selecting that. And now we're back to being able to select the whole document, and we can do the same thing as before, select same fill color, and now it will select objects across different groups. So this is really useful for when you need to leave a group for whatever reason and do some editing. So let's see. So we did images, we did these graphs. I can just show an example of one more type of plot that maybe I would, let me just move these, make some space. So I'll take a graph from R. So I have a heat map that I made in R, which I again exported as a PDF because PDFs keep a lot of the vector information. So I'm going to place that in here from R. Sure. Now this has a lot of elements, I mean, it has text, it has individual boxes, each with their own color. It has this key, or this legend, sorry, with like all the different colors, and each color in the gradient is its own element. These outlines for the object are its own elements. This is a hugely complicated figure. So for the most part, like, I wouldn't actually change very much in this figure, except to maybe make the fonts similar across the different panels. So in order to release all of these objects from each other, again, I have to do a release clipping mask using Alt-Command-7 a few times and ungroup the items like this. I delete that clipping mask there. I don't think R really carries over too many excess clipping masks and things, so we don't have to select too many. But so for instance, I've just selected a single gray frame around this box. And I don't really want these boxes, so I'm going to select all the boxes that have the same stroke color, all this gray stroke, and I'm just going to get rid of them. Great. Now I'm going to make the fonts match. So I just eyedropper tooled this set of text items. I want them aligned to the left, right, good. So I need to move the legend out of the way, so I'm going to highlight the area where my legend is, and obviously that's going to also highlight the text that's close to it, so I'm going to deselect by hitting Shift as I drag across the selected text so that I can deselect them as a group, so great. And I want the key values to also be the same. Good, like that. I want this to be the same as well. Of course, it's huge. So why don't we rotate these group labels so that they come out at a 45-degree angle from their position. So in order to do that, I select all of the ones that I want to edit, and I go to Object Transform, and there's an option for Transform Each, which means that rather than transform them as a group, because if I was to rotate them while they're all selected together, basically what that will do is transform the entire group. See? Like this. So we don't want that. We actually want to rotate each of them individually. So you go to Object Transform, Transform Each, and so we'll click Preview so that you can see what I'm doing here. And now when you do the transformation, it'll do them on each of the objects separately. Oops, so the other thing I want to note is that you can change the anchor positional reference of the object that's used to rotate. So before it was doing it to the center of the object, or rotating around the center, but I would rather it rotate around the uppermost left point of the object. Or even the upper center. Yeah, this looks okay. So we will hit OK and kind of shift these to be in the center of each of their respective columns, just like that. Let's make this the same size as this, and align it to the center, just like that. And make sure that our genes on the right-hand side are also distributed properly across the rows. So let's distribute like that. Great. So now at least our text objects kind of match the rest of the figure. This is probably the only thing I would want to change. Because we have so many different color elements in this legend here, see each individual part of the gradient is its own color. Because we have so many different individual elements, I would rather edit the colors in R and make sure I like those colors before I export it from R, because changing each of these individual gradient blocks and their corresponding heat map blocks is going to be a huge pain. So I would recommend just settling on your colors in R and then transferring them over. Now, if we wanted to, like, for instance, have the same group color, so let's pretend like these are, our blue cell type, we can color the text to match. So let's do it like this instead. We'll do it from here. Like that. Remember that text color is edited through its fill, not its stroke. So make sure if you use the eyedropper tool to do this, make sure you're selecting objects maybe that don't have a stroke but still have your fill. So this is another thing you can do. I mean, if we really wanted to like add some more sort of contrast elements to this, we could make, let's say, a rectangle around each of our different groups that would match the stroke. So I'm going to click on this line which has a stroke color but no fill, and so now we have a box that highlights the group. I just copied it over, but I'm going to change the color to orange, and then for our third group do the gray like that. Great. So they're a little bit overlapped, but that's okay. You can kind of get the idea here of how we might be able to sort of stylize these guys uniformly. Let's pretend like this was the end of our heat map. Great. I would recommend grouping our legend. But yeah, there you go. So here's another example of a sort of uniformly stylized object now. We added a couple of elements to introduce some consistent color across our different panels. We changed the fonts, obviously, to match across the different panels as well. And we created some masks around our images to make sure we're only showing parts of the image that we actually want to show. So that is pretty much it. Because we're not creating any schematic shapes here, we didn't do any drawing, we didn't do any illustration. We did maybe create some bounding boxes, like in this case, but that's about it. We didn't have to annotate any of our data here. We just created some labels within our image to match the colors found inside the image, and we just made sure that all the colors were the same. So that's one way to do some figure importing. Now remember, the big takeaways are that PDFs tend to store the most information about individual components of an image in like vector format that you can edit in Illustrator. And dragging and dropping PDFs into the Illustrator document won't actually load any of those data. So placing it into the document is the better way to go through File Place. If you place an image into an Illustrator document, you lose its link to the file that's in the directory on your computer. So if you were to open the document in on a different computer, you wouldn't have the dependence of its location on the computer, which means that you would be able to see it because it's essentially directly loaded into the document. Whereas if you drag and drop an image into an Illustrator document, you maintain its dependence on the object that's on your computer. So the benefit of that is that if you ever edit your image after you've placed it into, or after you've loaded it into the document, those changes would be reflected in your Illustrator document. And that can be useful if you need to change the brightness and contrast settings on your image, and you don't want to have to reload it into the Illustrator document after. But of course, it also means that since it's dependent on the file that's located on your computer, if you try opening the document on a different computer, the document won't be able to find the file. So that might explain why a lot of you have issues with sending other people Illustrator documents and it not loading elements in the figure. So make sure to place them if you're going to do that, again through the same file place feature. Great, so that's about it for this. Next time I'm going to cover how to more extensively use layering and groups to deal with figures that have a lot of complex elements, such as lots of different points, lots of different line segments, etc., etc. And also I will cover how to sort of start making bigger things like posters and stuff like that in Illustrator. Okay, great.